It is Friday, December 27th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back to another 2024 episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PS Plus reminder. The PS Plus Essential lineup for December is still live on PSN. Make sure you claim those games. And also PS Plus Extra Premium, that lineup is now live on PSN as well. Now, obviously, we don't have a lot to discuss this week because we're in that purgatory season of Christmas is over, right before the New Year's, everybody on holiday. Not a lot to discuss, but we do have some stories here, like, for example, Jak and Daxter on PSN. It seems this game, much like Sly Cooper 1, got the resolution boost, so there was another patch for the game. Download that. It looks a lot cleaner looking to the point where it's actually just about as sharp looking in terms of sheer image quality compared to the PS3 HD collection. So not too bad there. I actually don't have footage of what it looked like prior, right when it went up on PSN. I did not actually boot it just yet, and people were saying, oh, there's already a patch out for that game, and now it had the resolution boost that Sly Cooper 1 did, which Sly 2 and 3, I believe, already have that right off the jump. Either way, still cool that these PS2 games are getting this resolution boost, and there's not that many that implicit conversions has already done for PSN on PS4, PS5. So in theory, this should maybe be the new standard moving forward, and we only had this very brief period where they were just kind of okay looking, but any improvements is welcomed. Now, something else we should also mention as another little PSA here is the PlayStation Portal Cloud Streaming Beta, where right now there's about 200-something games on there. Actually, that's what they launched with initially. That was more than the 100 games they quoted on the PlayStation blog. But it does seem like they're adding more games on what appears to be a semi-weekly, weekly basis. Not entirely sure, but somebody's been cataloging the full game lineup on Reddit, and they're at like 220-something games now, so they might have added maybe another 20, 25 more games. Not a whole lot, obviously, but just something to bear in mind that even during the beta period, they are adding more games to it to where you can access and try those out. Some of the new classic games are on there as well, so not too bad considering you can't access the full game catalog on the portal, since it's still this preliminary beta period with this very sort of basic UI layout that's not exactly easy to use as far as like finding the game you want and all those, just a giant row of tiles, I should say. But either way, they're still expanding upon it, which is good. So if you've not checked that out, that's something to remember. Also, Portal got firmware 4.0.1 recently, which the minor change here would be the two standard items on the changelog, where it's basically mandatory. It always says improving system software performance, increasing or enhancing the readability and usability on some screens. But there was a slight hidden change in there, which is them actually changing the behavior of the PlayStation button when you're streaming via the cloud portion. So when you hit that, it will now bring the sidebar menu up, which is much more natural given that the button was basically dead when using the cloud streaming beta. So now you can hit that instead of having to manually swipe the screen or tap it to bring in that menu. So a very small change, but one that makes sense given the context. Moving on to an issue that Sony is finally cracking down on, and what I mean by that is they're cracking down on this for their own interest, because I'm talking about the web browser on PlayStation 5. Now, I'm sure a lot of you probably remember that for PS3, 4, Vita, PSP, we've always had a consumer-facing web browser application that you're meant to use. You can launch it, bookmark things, change the web address, just actually use the web browser. PlayStation 5 and now the Portal, they no longer let you do that. However, there's always been a sort of open secret web browser on the console. You know, the Portal and the PS5 do have web browser functionality, just that you have to access it by other means. Typically, that's something where you can go into the user and health settings or certain product pages. You can launch it from there. Sometimes you can fish through links and kind of escape PlayStation.com because you can't change the web address. And that's kind of the one way to do it, although I think they've kind of locked that down now. The other, much more easier way, and most people do this, is sending a URL on PSN. So you can message somebody, just google.com, and it turns into a clickable link. And so even though you can't edit the web address, you can just start from a search engine, do what you want, even use more PS5 features like pinning the web page to the side of the screen, get picture-in-picture. It's actually been in our PS5 tip videos for a while because, you know, it's a very handy thing. I do find it to be a bit clunky, and obviously it's more of a hassle because you're not really meant to use the web browser, but it was something you could do. It was an option. Now, the point of the story is, Sony is finally, it seems like they're not letting you do that anymore, because now PlayStation Safety is stepping in with automated messages to automatically delete certain URLs. It seems like it's very much an automated process in the matter of like, depending on what URL you are trying to send to another user, just to click the link, obviously, at that point, it just gets deleted automatically. So things like Google or Bing, DuckDuckGo. I tried Amazon, that does work. And then from there, you'd have to try and work your way outside of Amazon, but like that's the issue. So certain sites don't work anymore. Certain sites, it's an automatic delete. You do get follow-up emails from PlayStation.com. So this was like initially spotted and posted on Reddit by one user saying that, hey, this happened to me, I'm getting emails, maybe you shouldn't do this anymore, and I was able to verify that. So it is something where you probably should not be doing this anymore. Which is, it's weird too, because like obviously we know why Sony doesn't want you to access the web browser on PS5 or the Portal. The web browser has always been a very vulnerable place of access, and having the console at a certain point cracked, jailbreaks, custom firmware, things like that. Obviously PS5 is a very new recent console and they're staying on top of these things, but they just don't really want that to be a thing anymore, especially for a feature that in the grand scheme of things, a lot of people are not going to be using. I don't agree with it, but it's just, we can see why Sony is doing this. But what's weird is that it took this long for them to finally start cracking down on this, because we've had PS5 since 2020, and it's been a widely known, accepted thing to just like, yeah, send a URL on PSN, you can just access Google and pin to the side, and you know, why would you even let users click links from PSN messages? And it's just kind of a weird thing, but the point of the story is they are done with it, it would appear. Because if you do send enough PSN messages, as emails will imply, you're getting initial warnings, but you will get suspended on PSN at a certain point if you keep doing this, even though these URLs are not considered malicious. It's just, it's very obvious what the company is doing now. So it sucks. I don't really agree with it, but it was something we probably could have seen coming a mile away, because they never offered the web browser properly on PlayStation 5. So having said that, this is one feature and tip that we now have to advise you maybe should not be doing this anymore. Moving on to some more Bungie news, where it seems like Sony is still in this position of trying to, you know, clean up their purchase here. I guess that might be the best way to put it, considering that we've still got some talent moving from Bungie to SIE proper, and then you've got some senior leadership at Bungie leaving the studio, and that just means they're tightening up the team more and more, to the point where you've got a handful of people that are, you know, just not a part of the process anymore. But anyway, what happened recently was Josh Price, Bungie's former director of strategic partnerships, announced that he and his team are moving over to SIE directly as director of business development franchise strategy. Then, as spotted by the Game Post, Andros Jenkins, who was Bungie's chief strategy officer for 16 years, they left back in October, and then Johnny Ebert, who was Bungie's chief creative officer for 5 years, they recently left at some point without a formal announcement. Which all the while, behind the scenes, there's this lawsuit now going on with the former Bungie director, Chris Barrett, who previously was accused back in like that would have been August of this year, I believe, but it was the inappropriate misconduct and behavior with several female employees, and he was then fired. He's now filed a lawsuit against SIE and Bungie, claiming he was being mischaracterized and that the real reason he was fired was to avoid a $45 million retention bonus payout when the studio was acquired, obviously. So he's seeking defamation damages for no less than $100 million, which is an insane sum of money, but yeah, that's all going on behind the scenes as well, which at the very least for that, I can't imagine that's going to go anywhere, because I can't picture a scenario where SI and Bungie are not going to have this like due diligence process on making sure they have very firm ground on firing somebody, especially in the circumstance of them being entitled to a retention bonus. So sure, there's some clear upside for Sony and Bungie to get rid of somebody, but I can't picture any sort of scenario where the politics of a corporation like this, they're not going to be mindful of that kind of process and make sure that they have every ground to stand on and get rid of somebody that was likely very problematic, but I digress. At least as far as the studio goes, with more C-suits leaving, I mean, that's what we heard about Bungie the entire time throughout this acquisition process, was a lot of the senior leadership were the issue here. Now, Pete Parsons still at the company, obviously, so I can't really speak as far as like where he stands with with the studio and that sort of relationship and friction that might still be going on, or maybe it's loosening up a bit with the on-the-ground employees. I don't know if that's actually getting better or not. I mean, ideally, you would hope it is getting better, but the thing is, Pete Parsons was the one name as the CEO that kept coming up over and over and over again when you had all these former staff being laid off and they were being labeled the problem. Well, Pete Parsons and just the C-suite in general, so you do have a lot of senior leadership that are now leaving. It seems like any of the talent that Sony wanted to retain either got moved over into a separate team or moving over to SIE under that umbrella. So they are still in this process, even today, sort of salvaging and cleaning up and consolidating this purchase, which was still very expensive at $3.6 billion. Which kind of goes into a separate point of like, I've seen a lot of commentary around the Bungie acquisition of it being labeled a mistake. And to a degree, I mean, there's so many ways where we can definitely frame it that way because it was a lot of money. Sony overpaid. Bungie was lying about financials. This game was in worse shape than it was. Bungie was bloated, way too many employees and just mismanagement. And it's very much well documented as to what went wrong with this acquisition. My problem is simply, well, there is no conclusion here yet. As in, Bungie is not dissolved, right? Like, they're still in the process of sort of figuring this thing out, with Sony now having Bungie and assuming that responsibility of the studio and trying to tighten up the budget and figure out what they do with the studio moving forward. I don't know, it always seems a bit strange to act like, it's the same thing as, like a worst case scenario, Firewalk. Acquired a studio, shipped a game, the game's canceled, taken off the store shelves, studio closed. I mean, that is like a definitive sort of end of that story, a very bad result. We just can't say that for Bungie. Like, I don't really get why we're talking in such a conclusive manner. For all we know, in 5-10 years, Bungie might just be one of the financially most successful things that, SIE has ever done and that Sony's ever acquired, because who knows what ends up happening with the future of Destiny, Marathon, and anything else this studio that is now separate and working on this Gummy Bears project. I mean, that was something they brought in as well. So I don't know. It's like there's just a roadmap here that we have not realized just yet. So while there's a lot of turbulence on the way there, and arguably the $3.6 billion might have been better spent elsewhere, but it's just a matter of in the here and now, there is no ending to the story just yet. So Bungie might have this future and this path of being a valuable asset to the PlayStation business. It just seems like there were a lot of hurdles on the way there, if that is the future that's in store. Ideally. I mean, you don't want these things to go south necessarily, but for the time being, Bungie is still something that PlayStation is trying to clean up. Moving on to a new report from DFC Intelligence, which is a consulting firm in the entertainment and video game landscape, providing insight, market research, analysis into the various sectors of the business. And so one report that they put out was on the console marketplace. And so they did conclude that for the next console cycle, there will be only room for 2 major console players, and they don't expect Nintendo is going anywhere. So they say, and I quote here, Sony or Microsoft will struggle mightily in a distant third place, largely depending on which of those companies can gain early momentum. A new Sony system should have an advantage because of loyal base and strong Sony IP. Microsoft failed with Xbox Series XS, but has made major acquisitions to become the world's largest software publisher. Microsoft has the option of focusing on software and distribution models over hardware. Over the past 3 decades, the video game industry has grown more than 20 times, and after 2 years of slumping hardware and software sales, it's poised to resume growing at a healthy rate through the end of the decade. Now, it's also important to mention that this report does talk about the next lineup of Nintendo hardware coming out next year, which is very soon, as far as them revealing it and then also shipping it. That will have a 3-year runway, basically, of not really having a direct competitor per se, which Nintendo has always been this sort of slightly offshoot hardware in a sense where it's very complementary to your high-end console or your PC. But I digress. It's just a matter of them claiming that Nintendo has a very clear runway of selling a lot of units and, not really being checked here up until Sony and Microsoft step in with what DFC considers to be, still too early to call In fairness, I think we all know between the two which one would possibly drop off versus the other one, but they just at least make the semantic argument of, well, there's still launch pricing, the launch timing, launch lineup, basic features, and portability. Which is the other really interesting thing to consider, is that we're now just 3 years away, which is not far away at all, from a timeline where you've got Nintendo that will probably already be well into this life cycle for the Switch 2, and it's got a lot of software and probably doing reasonably well, more options in the portable PC landscape, and then Sony and Microsoft now returning to a portable option. Microsoft, in this case, a lot of rumors there are stirring around of them just straight up offering Xbox OS to third-party manufacturers, and they can make their own Xboxes, right, because that's kind of their whole shtick now, and so in a way, I think that that's the one company that's not going to be nearly as concerned with being more conservative in the console space, where it's like, we're selling a next-gen Xbox, here's a portable. I mean, they'll surely do that, but I mean, if they're going to be shipping games on every single platform, then they're not going to be as concerned as, say, a Sony with PS6 and a portable PlayStation. But the other thing I'm also very fascinated about seeing how this shakes out, especially with install base, is having Sony and Microsoft, in this case Microsoft for the first time, offering a proper portable again. And I say this because, portable PCs, they're very cool, and there's a lot of high customer satisfaction for them, but they're still not really like doing mainstream numbers. They're not selling in the same volume a Switch did, or the Switch 2 would. I mean, they're still in the low millions, basically, and they're kind of expensive, and they're still fairly niche, right? But PlayStation, which is such a household name, and they might want to conceivably offer a portable that is not priced as high. Now, I still fully expect this thing would likely be very expensive, but it might be a more compelling sell on paper versus the portable PCs, or versus Nintendo at that point, once Sony is finally able to offer something same as Microsoft. It's so insane to think where we'll be in just 3 years, and there's just going to be so many options and different hardware lineups and all this compatibility between devices and these sort of, in a way, open and closed ecosystems. There is a lot to digest, and we will be following it very closely here on LTPS. Now, another video game business story that popped up recently that was really fascinating to consider was from Andy Gavin, the former co-founder of Naughty Dog, where he mentioned on LinkedIn why they sold the studio to Sony back in 2001. And the simple answer is the budgets were skyrocketing. Now, mind you, they sold the studio in 2001 for an undisclosed amount. But it's fascinating to hear about this from Andy, where this problem has persisted for 20 years. So he talks about how their early 80s games were $50,000 to make, then Crash Bandicoot in the 90s cost $1.6 million, then Jak and Daxter hit the $15 million mark, and by Jak 3, it was $45 to $50 million. He said, and I quote, "Selling to Sony wasn't just about securing a financial future for Naughty Dog. It was about giving the studio the resources to keep making the best games possible without being crushed by the weight of skyrocketing costs and the paralyzing fear that one slip would ruin it all." It has been a well-documented fear in the games business, which is this doubling of budgets on new platform. It costs $1 million here, then 10, 15 here, then 45, 50 here, then 100 million here, and where we are today is 300 million on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S, X, PC. Even many Nintendo Switch titles are hitting the 9-figure mark without issue. It is a lot of money, and it's this is why there's so much consolidation. That's why so many studios are oftentimes looking for an out, and they're looking to sell, whether they're small or big established publishers like Activision. Now, moving on to a slight PSA news story, but we are going into 2025 very soon, and that actually does mean we have our first event coming very soon as well, and that is CES. So we do know that Sony's CES press conference is January 6th at 5 p.m. PST, so it actually is very soon, and always worth mentioning that for CES, for the longest time, historically, it was not really a PlayStation event. It's something where Sony Electronics is there to debut new camera stuff and TVs and this, that, and the fourth. I mean, for a long time, that's what CES was as a consumer electronics show for Sony, a consumer electronics giant. nowadays PlayStation is a very big footprint of the Sony Group's revenue. So in recent years, we've seen PlayStation have a slightly bigger presence. Nothing outstanding, but we've seen in recent years throughout the PS5 cycle, CES has been a place where we saw the PS5 logo, PSVR 2 hardware and trailer discussion, new trailers or PlayStation Productions updates. So we might have one or two things pop up. I'll be honest, I'm not really expecting anything this year, or anything major, I should say, because again, it's kind of mandatory at this point that the company has to say something about PlayStation at CES, but I'm just not entirely convinced it's going to be something big or a new trailer or X, Y, and Z accessories. I mean, that might be something they do, but for the most part, I would expect it to maybe be fairly light, although I would hope to be wrong about that. So that's coming very soon, and we'll be keeping tabs on what's going on at CES for PlayStation and the Sony Group. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And we had the Astrobot Festive Holiday DLC that we played on Tuesday. Very appropriate there. And then coming up, I think we'll probably go back to our sort of regular scheduled programming of an upload on Tuesday. And I assume that will be ready on time, but otherwise, I think that's basically it as we go into the new year. 2025 should be an exciting year for PlayStation because we are right in the middle of the, or we're just getting into the middle of the back half of the PlayStation 5 life cycle. So between some of the announcements we've had recently, we're going to have more coming up this year, next year, I should say, rather. Big games coming out like Yote, Death Stranding 2. A lot of good stuff should be in the pipeline there, so we'll be on the lookout for all that stuff. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.